Hi there. I guess I'm on. My son isn't here tonight, so I'm doing this in my relatively technologically clueless manner. Here's one thing I've noticed about getting older. I have kept up with computer technology pretty well, I would say, but I do find, maybe because of the demands on me in the last year, maybe I'm not stupider. It's possible. So anyways, hi everyone. Nice to see you here. Looks like I've got the chat working. Is everything working? Looks like it. All right, so I'm going to start with some questions that people sent me. Anyways, thank you for all you for being here, by the way. It's very much appreciated. It's quite remarkable, as far as I'm concerned, that you tune in to listen to me talk with you. And I definitely do appreciate it. So I'm going to start with some of the questions that people sent me earlier, and I'll keep an eye on the chat, YouTube chat as well. So hopefully the audio is good. What about that? How's the audio there, guys? So now Adam W. Peterson asked me a question that got 410 votes. He said, I am a web software developer. Are you hiring, or can I volunteer for anything? I can build anything. I can automate things. I could simply be an assistant of sorts. Thank you for your time. Well, what I would like to say about that is, first, thank you, Adam. It's much appreciated. And a lot of people have volunteered their time to me and their technological expertise. And as much as I'd like to make use of it, the simple truth of the matter is that I'm sufficiently overwhelmed by the complexity of my life at the moment that it's very difficult to undertake a new collaborative project with anyone. I mean, generally speaking, before all this political, what would you call it? Before all these political events overtook my life, I was already scheduled probably about 6 months to a year out. You know, all my time was already eaten up. And of course, the addition of everything that's happened in the last year to that has occupied my time to a degree that is really somewhat unimaginable. And so I just can't take on additional help, which is so strange because you'd think that help is help and that it would save time. But you know, it's very difficult to enter into a collaborative relationship with someone, and especially if you want to give them credit and do things properly. So at the moment, I'm afraid that I can't entertain any such offers, even though I'd like to. And there may come a time in the future, especially when I'm hopefully starting to work more on this online university project. I've got a few projects to finish up before that. The new personality test, which we've just about got all the bugs worked out of, and also the high school version of the future authoring program were all set up long before any of this happened. So I have to clear them out before I can concentrate on a new project. And I finished a book over the last couple of years too, called 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos, which is now available, by the way, if you're interested, on Amazon for pre-order. And so, anyways, this is my roundabout way of saying thank you very much, but I can't accept more help at the moment because my time is too restricted to make proper use of it. So, Clay's Norin, how to use the results in the new personality test for progress in life. Try to compensate some sides that received fewer points. Well, at the risk of sounding self-serving, that's actually why we developed the self-authoring suite, was to help people improve their, let's say, performance and mental health. Now, we don't have direct evidence that will improve personality, but I suspect that evidence would take a very long time to accumulate. What we do know is that the self-authoring suite, especially the future authoring suite, helps university students, for example, stay enrolled in university. It increases the probability of that by about 25% and increases grade point average by about the same. And there's good theoretical reasons for assuming that writing is a good way of writing about yourself and about your past and about your future is a good way of catalyzing personality transformation, because it appears that personality, the human psyche, is organized at the highest level of abstraction using something like self-narrative. And a well-developed narrative makes a frame for your life and helps you stabilize your negative emotions and also experience more positive emotion, because you only experience positive emotion in relationship to a goal, and that can make goal-directed activity a lot more rewarding. So it's a lot easier to engage in activities that aren't intrinsically rewarding if they're linked to something that you really find important. And so I would say, if you want to work on your personality, well, the first thing you have to do is figure out who it is that you want to be. And then you have to make a plan. And maybe you have to clean up your past as well. And the self-authoring suite was designed, quite carefully in order to help people do that with a relative minimum of effort. Not that it's easy, because it's not, but a relative minimum of effort compared to other technologies, let's say, and like long-term psychotherapy, and to make it cost-effective as well. So, okay, so another question voted up, 77 votes. Australia is holding a plebiscite on whether to legalize gay marriage. I'm against the Yes campaign, but only because it's backed by cultural Marxists. I'm curious to hear your views on gay marriage. Well, I would be against it too if it was backed by cultural Marxists, because it isn't clear to me that it will satisfy the ever-increasing, what would you call it, demand for an assault on traditional modes of being. Now, with regards to gay marriage specifically, that's a really tough one for me, because, I can imagine I can't do anything really other than spout platitudes about it, I suppose, unfortunately. If the marital vows are taken seriously, then it seems to me that it's a means whereby gay people can be integrated more thoroughly into standard society, and that's probably a good thing. And maybe that would decrease promiscuity, which is a public health problem, although obviously that's not limited to gay people. Although gay men tend to be more promiscuous than average, probably because there's no women to bind them with regards to their sexual activity. The problem is that it does seem to me to be part of a wedge, and it isn't obvious to me that legalizing gay marriage has done anything to decrease the demands that the radical left neo-Marxist types are placing on traditional society. So those are my views. I know they're confused, because I'm in favor of extending the bounds of traditional relationships to people who wouldn't be involved in a traditional long-term relationship, but I'm concerned about the undermining of traditional modes of being, including marriage, which has technically and historically been a union between a man and a woman, fundamentally for the purpose of raising children in a stable and an optimal and stable environment. So, and marriage has already taken a fair bit of damage over the last few decades. Poor people are increasingly less likely to be married, and that's really not good for them as far as I'm concerned. Hi, I'm currently going through a hard time as a first-time mum with a 9-month-old. I feel depressed and anxious, and am highly neurotic and volatile. Can you suggest anything to help me be a better mum? Well, lots of people have a hard time with their 9-month-old. I guess the first question would be, are you getting enough sleep? Do you have enough help? Are you eating enough, especially in the morning? And you're going to feel highly neurotic and volatile to some degree because, well, you've been through quite a physiological trauma, and it's very demanding to have a newborn baby. So the best thing I could say, not knowing you, is to make sure that you have people around that you can talk to about your baby, and that you can and that you can take a break when you need to, and have someone spell you. I mean, that's often the role that a husband plays in the first year of a baby's life, is that he's supposed to watch the mother to make sure that she doesn't get overwhelmed by the demands of the baby. And so I would hope that you're able to ask for support when you need it, and not to be afraid of asking for support, especially to get a rest and to get something to eat, because that's really important, especially in the morning. Other than that, I can't tell you anything really specific, unfortunately, given that I don't know anything about the specifics of your situation. if it gets out of hand, you should go. The other thing I should say is, if it gets out of hand, you should go speak with your doctor, with a professional, because you might have postpartum depression. I mean, there's some dispute about whether that exists and as an independent diagnostic entity, but you can certainly be physiologically stressed, and if you have a predisposition to depression, then that kind of physiological stress and sleep disruption can bring it on. So I would say, if it really gets out of hand, don't hesitate to go talk to someone professional. It may be necessary to do that, because you don't want to fall too far down a hole, that's for sure. So Emma Jovanovic says, Dr. Peterson, I want to thank you. I guess this isn't a question, for what you do. I'm a 22-year-old girl, and your videos are helping me so much with figuring my life out. You alone are helping me be braver every day. Well, I'm really happy about that. And I like your emphasis on bravery, because one of the things that we've learned as clinicians say is that when you help people overcome anxiety, it isn't that you make them less anxious necessarily. Although I think you can do that to some degree by having people confront some of the demons in their past, but instead of making them less anxious, you make them braver, and that's not the same thing, right? Because there's lots of reason to be anxious. The world's full of uncertainty and fear, and reasons for fear and reasons for pain, but to be braver means to confront those voluntarily, and that's really a good thing. When will the next Bible lecture occur? October 24th. There'll be 3 of them before the end of December, and I want to keep them going into the future. They've been quite successful, I would say, and I would like to go through the whole book, although that would probably take me the rest of my life. But I do really think it's necessary, because it is the case that the specific narratives and the meta-narrative that are embedded in the biblical stories and its surrounding literature are at the fundament of Western culture, and we need to reconnect with that in order to make sure that our culture stays strong. And I don't think it's particularly strong right now, and that's a very bad thing for everyone. It leads to nihilism and despair and an inability to plan for a meaningful future, and cynicism and all of those things. And that's especially bad for young people, because when you're young and your life is ahead of you, that's the last time that you need to be nihilistic and cynical. It's definitely not good. So Darkpire 2 says, how can you dispute the theory that Jesus is just a rewrite of the sun god myth? Well, I wouldn't necessarily dispute that theory, although I would dispute the just. I mean, the strange things about the biblical stories, and let's say about the New Testament stories, is that they echo across multiple levels of analysis. And so there is an astrological element to the Christ story. That Jung wrote about a fair bit in a book called Ion, which is a very terrifying book. And there are echoes of the myths of the sun god. But the funny thing is, and this is one of the things I can't really understand about the biblical stories, is that they manifest themselves at multiple levels of interpretation simultaneously. And you could say that that's merely a consequence of continual historical reworking, and I suppose that could be the case, but the fact that they manifest themselves as a personal story and as a cosmic story and as a historical story and as a mythological story, and that it all works at the same time, strikes me as pointing to something that's really somewhat beyond our current level of understanding. I can't elaborate on that a lot because it would take us into places that I really would rather not go, but I do believe that there's something synchronous, using Jung's terminology, about the death and resurrection story, and the synchronous element is associated with the fact that the story echoes across so many levels of analysis. And my sense is that when something echoes across many levels of analysis, that means that it's approaching something like a very deep truth. So I know that isn't normally how we go about determining what constitutes truth, but we don't know everything about how to determine what constitutes truth yet, and there are many things that we have yet to figure out, and that's certainly one of them as far as I'm concerned. So there is a sun god myth element, certainly, and parallels between Christ and Horus, for example, but that doesn't mean you can just say it's just a rewrite. I don't think that that's historically or psychologically accurate. Have you watched Rick and Morty? No, I haven't. Many people have told me to watch Rick and Morty, although they said it's very dark, and well, that doesn't bother me so much, I suppose, although I'm plenty dark, perhaps without adding to it. So, but I would like to watch it, and I probably will. So, I would love for you to come and do a talk in Montreal. Well, you never know, that might happen. I've been talking to Gad Saad about that a fair bit. You know, he's coming to Toronto November 11th, so we can do the talk that was shut down by Ryerson back in August, so I'm looking forward to that. So, what's the best way to stop drinking alcohol and start doing my best in my psychology degree? It's affecting my study, but I can do very well if I stop. I'm 26. Well, Paul, what I would say is, I think you should do the future authoring program, and you should really concentrate. There's a section in it that helps you determine what your positive view of your future would be, but another section that helps you determine what would happen in your life if your negative habits got out of control. And one of the things that can really help you control your alcohol intake is to really, really think through what you're giving up and where you could be in 5 years if you don't get it under control. And a proclivity to alcoholism can be a really vicious thing. You know, lots of people get dragged down into the mud by alcohol. Excess alcohol intake, especially if they're sensitive to the opiate response that alcohol can produce. And you can tell that when you drink, you know, you get alert and let's say more enthusiastic and energetic, and then you don't want to stop drinking. That's definitely a bad sign with regards to developing alcoholism. So I would say you need to figure out something that's more important to you than drinking. And also think through very hard the negative consequences of continuing it. You're at about the age, 26, where you should stop. I mean, guys who are going to stop generally start to slow down pretty intensely around that age. You know, also treating your psychology studying as a full-time job can also be helpful. So, you know, get up at 8 in the morning or 7:30 in the morning and start hitting the books by 9 and put in a 6 to 8 hour day. And then even if you do keep drinking, at least you're moving forward. So that's what I would say about that. Are you a science fiction fan? You referenced Heinlein's Starship Troopers in a lecture, and your ideas often remind me of Harry Seldon's plan from Asimov's Foundation series. Hey, well, when I was a kid, which is quite a long time ago now, I lived in this town called Fairview, Alberta, which was a town of about 3,000 people, way the hell north, 350 miles northwest of Edmonton. And I had this neighbor across the street, across the alley actually, and he had a huge science fiction library. There must have been, I don't know, 5,000 books there, the 1960s and 1970s classics like Heinlein and Asimov. And he would let me go over there and take like 20 books at a time, and I was reading about a book a day at that point, and I read science fiction like mad, probably till I was about 19 or so, and maybe a little younger than that, and then turned more to classic literature when I got to college, and also partly as a consequence of some lessons that the local librarian taught me about what to read. So I was a science fiction fan. I haven't read science fiction for a very long time, although I was pretty happy with it when I was a kid. So Richard Van Koppen says, yes, I have agraphobia and would love to hear about anxiety. Well, that's a rough thing to have, agraphobia. So agraphobics get increasingly isolated and afraid of things outside of their domain of familiarity. And often what happens with agraphobia is that people who develop it are afraid of two things. They're afraid that something is going to go dreadfully wrong with their health, especially with regards to their heart. So they start to become afraid that maybe they'll have a heart attack, and that they'll die in public, far from a hospital, and that they'll make a fool of themselves while they're doing it, or while they think they're dying. And so it's a combination of two fears, and one is fear of mortality, and the other is fear of social judgment. And you might think about those as the two main categories of fear that possess people, because one is associated, well, obviously with mortality and death, and the other is associated with exclusion from the group, which of course, can lead to mortality and death. And so the agoraphobics get the worst of both worlds. And it's often a disease of middle-aged women, but not always. And there are often people who've been somewhat dependent in their previous lives and then undergo some traumatic event like a divorce or the death of someone close, and at the same time are perhaps experiencing heart palpitations that are associated with menopause that brings ideas of mortality to mind. And that can trigger a panic attack, which is a very, what would you call it, unpleasant experience to say the least. And then that fear of panic attacks starts making people avoid, and that's when agoraphobia develops out of anxiety disorders with panic attacks. So you go out and maybe you go to a mall and maybe you're in a crowd and maybe you start thinking about, well, your heartbeat and about the fact that someone close to you has died, and maybe then you become aware of your heartbeat and you start to panic because you feel that maybe the beat is irregular or that you can't detect it as well as you usually can. And then that makes your heart accelerate because it makes you afraid, and then you get more what would you call sensitive to that, and that makes your heart rate beat even faster, and then you panic and you want to get to the hospital to get checked out to make sure that you're all right, and then you make your fatal mistake, which is that you avoid going back to the mall, and then you go to a grocery store and the same thing happens, and then you start to avoid going to the grocery store, then you start avoiding the subway or taxis or crowds or anywhere you might get trapped and wouldn't be able to get to a hospital. Soon you end up avoiding everything. And that's when your life really starts to become a living hell. So the basic way to treat agoraphobia, there's two ways. And one is to develop some control over breathing, to do progressive relaxation. And the way you do that is that you start by concentrating on your toes and your feet, and then your ankles, and then your shins and your knees. You move all the way up your body and let the tension flow out of your muscles and regulate your breathing calmly and carefully so that you can learn to relax. And then you go out voluntarily and start to confront the things you're afraid of. So for example, if you're afraid of the mall, maybe you go to the parking lot and you look at the mall, and then you walk close to the door and you look inside, and then you go home because that's enough for one day. But you do progressive exposure, and that's one of the basic rules of psychotherapy, is that if you're afraid of something, you progressively and voluntarily expose yourself to it. And that generally, it's the voluntary exposure that's curative, right? Accidental exposure can make you worse, but voluntary exposure can be curative, and that's sort of associated with the myth of the hero and the dragon. The hero is the person who goes out voluntarily to confront the dragon and overcome it and get the treasure. And so if you voluntarily expose yourself to things you're afraid of, like no more than you can tolerate, then you'll find that you get braver and you learn that you can tolerate the fear, and that can chase the agoraphobia back. But it's very important to do it on a regular basis. And if you have agoraphobia, full-fledged agoraphobia, you should probably consult professional help, because it's a very tricky condition and it can really impair you badly. So that's what I would recommend. Hi JP, I'm wondering how the computer program that rates university courses as worthwhile or not is coming along. Well, it isn't rating them as worthwhile, it's rating them as postmodern, neo-Marxist or not, and it's actually fully developed. I was going to launch it, and I didn't design it. Somebody volunteered to design it and presented it to me, and it seems to work very well. I was going to launch it at the end of August so that this year's university students could benefit from it, but there was the Charlottesville event, and then I got busy, and I also wasn't feeling great, and so I just didn't hit the window of time properly. But I hope to be able to launch it for the January incoming class, to do a video about what's wrong with the university system, the many things that are wrong with the university system, and to launch the website at the same time. I also had people suggest to me that maybe it wasn't a good idea, that it would increase polarization, but I've thought about that for about a month and a half, and I think that the benefit to the consumer, so that would be the informed student, outweighs any danger of polarization. And besides that, something has to be done, because the situation in the universities is really ridiculous. So, all right, so let's see what else we've got here in the chat room. DVSSK8ER3, that's quite a mouthful, says, I'm studying to be a teacher, but I'm also an introvert. Could this be a big problem? can I still be a successful teacher? Actually, what seems to predict success at teaching best is intelligence and conscientiousness. That's the data so far. So if you're conscientious, then you'll probably be fine. I mean, introverts have a harder time speaking in front of groups, but you can learn to do that. You know, an introvert can become a very successful public speaker. May not enjoy it the same way that an extrovert might, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn the skills. And what I would recommend for an introvert is the same thing that I do when I'm lecturing, is I never talk to the whole group. You know, it doesn't matter how big the crowd is. I'm always picking out individuals in the group and talking specifically to them. So I'll make a point to an individual and I watch their face and see if they're nodding and understanding, right? Because that way you make contact with the entire audience. And then, you know, I'll talk to someone for about 15 seconds or so. I don't want to put them on the spot too much. And then I shift my attention to someone else and I sort of pinpoint around the room. And that keeps everybody in the room focused on what I'm saying, because each person reflects the entire crowd back to you. And so I would say if you're an introvert, or if you want to speak in public in general, forget about the damn crowd. It doesn't exist. Speak to people one at a time, and an introvert can do that just fine. So, you know, that's where your strength would be. And I would say you're much more likely to be unsuccessful as a teacher if you don't work hard at it and if you're not interested in it. So if you're an introvert, I wouldn't worry about that. I don't think that that'll be the biggest problem that you'll face. So nicks are overrated, says ditch your barber. Well, I actually like my barber quite a bit. His haircut's a little shorter than I'm accustomed to, and there's some reasons for that. But what can I say? Hair grows back, and I'll be just as beautiful as I was before in no time. So I guess that's how that is. See, now Richard Van Kopen says my haircut's looking fresh. So who's that? Nicks are overrated. Take that. Yeah. So. Would you consider having a discussion with Thomas Sowell? That's Sam Dugan. Dugan, probably. Yeah, I definitely considered. I'm thinking hard about reaching out to him. I have some discussions coming up that you might be interested in. So I'm going to talk on Jocko Willink's podcast, and he was the leader of the Navy SEALs team in Ramada, and he's quite the tough character. I met him down in San Diego a while back, a month ago or so, and that was very interesting. I have a video already prepared that's an interview with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. It was done by Skype and needs some editing, and so that's been a bit delayed. I had a discussion with Nina Paley, who's a great animator. You guys should look her up. That's Nina Paley. She animated a lot of the Old Testament and set it to music, and I think her animations are unbelievably beautiful, and she has great musical taste. They're illegal videos, basically. She's making an illegal movie. But anyways, I really like her stuff. I also had a discussion with Claire Lehman, who runs Quillette, which is a new news magazine online, which I think has got real promise, and we had a good discussion. And let's see, is that it? I think that's it. And you probably know, or maybe you don't. I just finished a discussion with Camille Paglia, and we went down there. I took a film crew down there to Philadelphia and met her at her university, and we talked for a couple of hours, and that was really interesting. She's quite the fireball, that woman, and unbelievably verbally fluent and sharp. And so I finally met someone who could talk more than me, and that's probably good. So, but I really enjoyed speaking with her, and I think about 100,000 people have watched that now in a day, so that's pretty good. So we talked about postmodernism and the malaise that confronts the modern university and all of those sorts of things. So Robin Dion says, do you ever miss Montreal? Hey, I was just in Montreal. I went there to saw a band called Half Moon Run, which a band I would highly recommend. They were playing with the Montreal Symphony Orchestra, and I got invited to meet one of the singers and also go and see the concert, which was excellent. And yeah, I miss Montreal. Montreal's a great city. For you Americans who are listening, you should go visit Montreal, man. It's a cool place. And spend a week there in the summer. It's it's a really good city in every way. So, yeah, so. It seems we are bound to repeat history, and what is old becomes new again. Why is it that we can't seem to find equilibrium within a society? Ideas begin with good intentions but lead towards the extreme. Yeah, well, the reason we can't find equilibrium is because the environment that we live in isn't in equilibrium. And so I kind of imagine it this way. It's like we're traversing the back of a giant, this is obviously a symbolic reference, of a giant serpent, and it weaves back and forth, and you don't know at any moment which way it's going to curve and turn. And so sometimes it turns to the right and sometimes it turns to the left, and what that means politically is that sometimes we have to turn to the right and sometimes we have to turn to the left. And we don't know exactly when those, we don't know exactly how to time that. And so what we all have to do is keep our eyes open and tell the truth and discuss things with each other, especially with people who have political beliefs that are different than us, so that we can ensure that we haven't tilted too far one way or the other. And that's why I'm an advocate of free speech, or one of the many reasons I'm an advocate of free speech, is because it's the continual dialogue between people of different temperamental types that keeps us oriented as close as we can to the center of the serpent's back. And so there is no permanent equilibrium. There's only the equilibrium that's produced by continual negotiation. And a democracy is a formalized negotiation. And so, and it's free speech that keeps it healthy and alive. So there's no permanent equilibrium state except death, and it's always negotiation in relationships too. Like if you have an intimate relationship or a familial relationship or even a friendship, there's no final equilibrium state. You have to communicate with each other honestly all the time and keep the relationship moving to adjust the environment that the relationship is operating in. And that's how it stays alive. And in an intimate, long-term intimate relationship like a marriage, it's a continual, it takes continual effort. It's worthwhile effort in that, but you have to be conscious and awake to keep your relationship alive. And you have to be communicating all the time. Well, maybe not all the time, because you can over-communicate too, but so that's why we can't reach a state of permanent equilibrium. Okay, let's go back to the previously submitted questions. How could I overcome my fear of driving on freeways? Well, one of the things you could do, this is Ellis, is do a fair bit of imagining driving on freeways and try to make the imagining as realistic as possible. But then the other thing you can do is, again, it's graduated exposure. If you're afraid of driving, go drive with someone you trust in a parking lot on Sunday morning when there's no one there. And then drive around the block in a street that isn't busy, and then go to a slightly busier street, and then go to a slightly busier street. And then find a highway that's like just a two-laner, so that you can practice merging and that sort of thing. And you got to build a plan, say with 20 degrees of difficulty, with the highest degree of difficulty maybe being merging onto a busy 4-lane highway. You could go at night and practice merging onto the busy highway because it won't be busy at night. So I would say what you do is you break it down into small steps and then practice each step until you're bored with the step. And when you're bored with it, that means you're no longer anxious about it. And don't quit. Stick at it, because it's really useful to overcome a fear. And once you've identified a fear, then you've identified something to overcome that can definitely make you stronger. So good luck with it, and get professional, take a driving course if you need to as well. And find someone to work with that isn't going to make you nervous and isn't going to harass you, but don't quit. It's really important to overcome a fear like that. Uh-oh, I just clicked something I shouldn't have clicked. Actually, I'm pretty happy with myself. My son isn't here, as I mentioned, and I'm still not destroying this completely, although I may have done it now. No. See, that's what happens when you brag, because now all I've got is one question from Pigeonhole and not all of them. Let's see. Got it. Ha! Back to chart was the trick. So, hey, I'm actually managing this not too badly. So, let's see here. Some more questions from the YouTube people. Dr. Peterson, I'm really hoping you can share your thoughts on the Vegas shooting. Yeah. Well, what I would do is recommend the biblical lecture I did on Cain and Abel, I would say, because I think that that's a good summary of the state of mind that somebody has to be in order to do what was done at Las Vegas. So you have to be very, very embittered by life in order to do that sort of thing. And you have to be searching for revenge, I would say. And it's not, you might think, well, it's only revenge on other people because you've developed hatred for people, but it's deeper than that. It's not just hatred for people. I would say it's hatred for being itself and the desire to take revenge on being for the outrage of the tragedy and suffering that's associated with being. And maybe the tragedy and suffering that's been part and parcel of your own life. And that makes you embittered. And then past embittered becomes outraged, and past outraged becomes, well, homicidal or even genocidal. And that's a terrible state of mind to be in. It's a hellish state. I believe that the best way to conceptualize the state of mind that someone has to be in order to do something like the Columbine shootings, for example, or what happened in Las Vegas, is that you're really, and you have to speak about it in religious languages, you're really out for revenge against God for the outrage of creation. That's what it looks like to me. And that's a state of mind that's truly hellish. And you can get there by brooding long enough. Now, it's also possible, this guy didn't have any previous history, criminal history or anything like that. And he's pretty old, so there's also the possibility of some kind of neurological pathology that might be characteristic of him, some degenerative neurological disease. There was a kid years ago at the University of Texas at Austin who climbed up on the tower there and shot a number of people with a high-powered rifle, and he had a fast-growing tumor on his hypothalamus and had reported like these being overcome with extreme feelings of rage. And so that's another possibility. But I would say the embitterment hypothesis is the strongest one. I would also say, too, I noticed that Steven Pinker tweeted this today, is that one of the ways of controlling this sort of thing would be for the press to agree, not for there to be a blanket agreement, not to publicize the name or any other identity markers of the people who do the shooting. Because there's also this really, what would you call it, arrogance. It's a kind of arrogance and pride, last-ditch arrogance and pride that is associated with the fantasies that drive this sort of behavior. And the fantasy is something like, well, after I do this, everyone will sure know who the hell I was, even though maybe I was ignored or unhappy when I was alive. After I'm dead, everybody's going to know who I was and what I did. And, so there's this underground desire for fame. I guess it's notoriety, but notoriety might be preferable to being ignored. And so, there's a lot of talk about gun control, and that's understandable, especially with regards to automatic rifles. Although I also understand why the people who are gun owners are afraid of allowing what they regard as one of their fundamental rights to be infringed upon. But it would certainly be useful if we stop giving people who do this sort of thing $100 million worth of free publicity and all the notoriety they can manage. So, that's another way of thinking about controlling it. So, Antonio Silva says, you need a break, have a glass of wine, relax. Yeah, well, I was just I have this little cabin up north of Toronto, about 3 hours north, that my wife bought with some money that her dad left her, gave her actually, he's still alive. And I was up there this weekend and it was relaxing. I was working a bit on this new personality scale and on the Palia video, but I did relax a bit, and I'm actually feeling a lot better than I was for the last Q&A. So The mornings are still rough, but by this time of night I'm feeling vaguely human, so thank God for that, because it was pretty brutal. So anyhow, Franklin says, fans are cancer for the authentic individual. Well, that's a tough one, I mean, cancer, no, that's too dramatic. I mean, I guess that what you're pointing at is the danger of fame, and I can certainly appreciate that. I can't say that I'm particularly comfortable with it, which might seem to be rather hypocritical, as it isn't like I've shied away from exposing my views in public. But I felt that I was driven to that by necessity and also by my desire to educate people. However, I would say, despite the fact that I'm somewhat uncomfortable with it, I think that's mostly because of the responsibility. I've been terrified for a whole year that I'd say something, unforgivably stupid and, demolish myself in public and feel guilty and horrible about that for the rest of my life. And so far I've been fortunate. There's been some close calls, but I've been fortunate. But, now when I go places, people often recognize me. Even at this little town we went up to this weekend, there were 2 people that came up to me in the parking lot and were excited to meet me. And, the vast majority of encounters, all of the encounters I have with people in public have been really wonderful. I have to say that. The people have been extremely friendly, and, sometimes they're a bit starstruck, which I find strange. I can see the projection, so it's unsettling for me. Although I'm not judging anybody for it. It's just a strange thing to observe. But I can't complain about the fact that people are positively predisposed to what I'm doing. I mean, it's such a privilege. I can't imagine what it would be like to be hated publicly. I think that would just kill me. I really think that. But so, I mean, it's. I suppose there's the possibility of having that sort of thing go to your head, and and I mean that happens to people. But I think I've said this before, maybe on the Q&As. I have a pretty sensible family, and I have a pretty, what would you say? I have a pretty good sense of my limitations, I would say. We could even call it an acute sense, and so I'm not particularly worried that this is going to go to my head in some way that would, inflate my ego or something like that, I mean, I think one of the things I have noticed is that I might be a little less patient with people when I'm speaking, because I'm more used to than might be good for me to be listened to, and so I have to watch that. But I've always been pretty noisy and talkative, and so that's probably something that's plagued me or been a characteristic of me ever since I was a little tiny kid. I mean, I used to talk all the time when I was a little guy. I mean, I think my cousin Eric Poneth, he probably listens to this. He used to call me Motor Mouth, and that was about exactly right. I was like a miniature Camille Paglia. So, anyways, I can't complain about having, let's say, fans. People have been unbelievably good to me, and I'm really grateful for that. So, what is the best way to find a routine when you're diagnosed bipolar? Well, I would say a couple of things. The first is try to set your sleep-wake cycle stably. So pick a time in the morning to get up. That's the most important thing. Get up at the same time every morning. And that might be difficult both when you're manic and when you're depressed, but the closer you can stick to that, the better. And I would also say try to stabilize when you go to bed. And maybe a little later rather than a little earlier, because you don't want to be laying there flipping around like a fish trying to go to sleep. You want to stabilize your sleep-wake routines because bipolar disorder is in part a circadian rhythm disorder. And so anything that destabilizes your circadian rhythms is going to increase the probability that you'll have an episode. And that includes flying. I do believe that at Gatwick Airport, in England, there's a special team that deals with people whose mania has been triggered by the overnight flight. So, and then the other thing I would say is stabilize the times you eat, because these basic biological rhythms, eating and sleeping in particular, are part of what stabilize your nervous system. And if you have bipolar disorder, then you're likely to be very susceptible to destabilized, routinized activities. Routinize your life to the degree that that's possible. And I would say the other thing you can do is use a calendar, and like a Google Calendar or whatever calendar. And I would say that's a good thing for everyone who's listening to think about. So you want to plan out your days and your weeks. And you don't plan a prison, right? You use the calendar to design the days that you would like to have. And so part of that's going to be responsibility, obviously, because you have to keep up with your responsibilities, or they overwhelm you and they multiply like hydras. But you need to plan for things that you really want to do as well. And the calendar can really be your friend. And I would say of all the things that you can do to organize yourself and routinize yourself, learning to use a calendar is probably among the foremost. And it doesn't matter if it takes you a year to get good at it. I mean, you've got the rest of your life then to benefit from that. And you should make friends with a calendar, like I said, and don't treat it like a prison. But it's really important to stabilize yourself as much as possible. So Periphery Pete says, I fell asleep listening to you. Whoop, my battery died. I gotta change it. All right, looks like everything's okay again. I use a reflex camera on my, and it has a battery and no electrical plug-in, so I'm afraid I'm at the mercy of its battery. It's a very high quality camera though, so I think it's worth the trouble. Anyways, Periphery Pete said, I fell asleep listening to you. Which, that doesn't sound so good, so that part's not so good. But this part's good. The next day, my 60 filterless cigarettes a day habit disappeared. Not sure what you said, but thank you, Claire X. Hey, well, if you can figure out what you were listening to, maybe I can make a tape of things to listen to by Jordan Peterson while you're falling asleep to fix your cigarette habit. But anyways, I think that's great. Don't start again. Or if you do, make sure you quit again. I'm really glad to hear that. And I've never had that particular talent pointed out to me before, so that's pretty interesting and comical. So, do you believe there's a strong undercurrent of Gnosticism in our country? Gnosticism, by the way, is the doctrine, heretical doctrine from a classical Christian perspective, that you can attain religious insight through understanding. That's a oversimplified view, but things like the sacred feminine and hatred of the created world. God, that's a complicated question. I think there's an undercurrent of wannabe Gnosticism in our country. I think that people believe they can come to religious enlightenment through understanding, but that they're generally less willing to do the work that would be necessary to do that than is in fact necessary. It takes an awful lot of study. Like, it took me years of reading Jung to really start to understand what he was talking about. And you could think about Jung as a Gnostic, but most people who talk about Jung haven't read anything he wrote. Well, that's true often of things that people talk about in general. But I think there is a place for understanding in religious belief, or otherwise I wouldn't be doing this biblical lecture series. But I think it's pseudo-Gnosticism fundamentally, and it's people putting forward ill considered opinions in the place of solid religious symbolic doctrine. And I think that's a big problem. I think it's part of what makes us weak. And I think we are, at the moment, weak in our foundations as a civilization. So, I have trouble regulating my emotions. I have a suspicion it's to do with the fact that I'm 98th percentile in openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism, and 2nd percentile in agreeableness and extroversion. Any tips on dealing with that? Yeah, well, if you're really high in openness and you're really high in neuroticism, that can be a rough combination. The conscientiousness should actually help with that, although it might make you a bit perfectionistic. The problem with being high in openness, which is creativity and interest in ideas, and high in neuroticism, which is tendency towards anxiety and emotional pain, is that like open people like to break open boxes, conceptual boxes, and see what's inside, like Pandora's box. But people who are high in neuroticism are more likely to respond negatively to complexity and uncertainty. And if you're an open person and you're always thinking up new things, you tend to saw off the branch that you're sitting on a regular basis, and that can be pretty destabilizing. Any tips on dealing with that? Well, I would repeat what I said earlier. I think that one of the things that you do if you're high in anxiety is to stabilize your sleep-wake cycles. So get up at the same time, go to bed at the same time, and eat at the same time. Make sure that you eat breakfast, and a big breakfast too, that's heavy on fat and protein, because if you're hungry and then you stress yourself, especially if you're high in neuroticism, you destabilize your insulin production system, and it won't restabilize till you go to sleep again. So I would say like two things. One is have a big breakfast, and then also if you're feeling particularly anxious, try eating something, not carbohydrates, and see if that helps, because you might be somewhat permanently dysregulated in your stress-related insulin production. That would be worth trying. I would also say that you should shield yourself to some degree from news sources and sources of bad news, especially catastrophic news, because most of it isn't news. It's the repetition of things that we already know full well, and there's reason to protect yourself from an onslaught of negative information, especially when it's not really necessary for you. I mean, I don't think you should bury your head in the sand, but constant exposure to the catastrophes of the world, especially when there's nothing that you can do about those catastrophes, even hypothetically, is something that can really destabilize people. I often tell people in my clinical practice, which isn't operating right now, by the way, to shield themselves from news reports, because it's just too much. If you're depressed and anxious, it's just not something that you need. It's not helpful to you. 2nd percentile in agreeableness and extroversion. Well, you know, one of the things that you can do if you're that low in agreeableness, that shouldn't dysregulate your emotions, but it might interfere with your relationships with other people, you know, because you might be a little bit harder to, you might take other people's feelings into consideration less than might be good for you. One of the things that people who are low in agreeableness can do is to try to think of things they could do for other people and make that a practice. You know, like maybe once a week you could consciously do someone a favor or give someone a gift, something like that, and practice being, what would you call it, compassionate and polite. You know, that'll expand your personality rather than transforming it. So then maybe you could have the advantages of being disagreeable, which means you're tough-minded and skeptical and competitive, and those can all be really good things. But it would be nice to be able to leaven that a little bit with the ability to take other people's perspectives a bit more and to take them into account. And then, you know, if your relationships improve, that can also improve your emotional stability, because one of the ways that people regulate their anxiety is by having people around them that they get along with. Because, you know, if you upset people, then they upset you, and especially if you're high in neuroticism, and that can increase your anxiety and your pain. So, Mithridate says, should I hide my anti-feminism, I presume, as I study university to become a nurse? Well, look, you shouldn't make unnecessary enemies. and you probably shouldn't mouth your opinion more than necessary. But I think you risk damaging your soul under certain circumstances when you don't say what you think. So I wouldn't hide it, because I think it's dangerous to hide it, and you also won't find the other people that you listen to. But I would say be prudent, don't falsify your opinions when you're writing. That's a big mistake. Don't falsify your opinions when you're speaking. You can always choose not to speak, but if you feel that you would be doing damage to your integrity, then you have to say what you have to say. Do it carefully, and prepare for the consequences. Probably prepare beforehand, I would say. So I think the hiding is a bad idea, like I said, but don't make unnecessary enemies, because there's just no utility in that. How important do you believe the American right to bear arms and maintain militias? Is it equivalent to the right to free speech? Well, I don't think anything is equivalent to the right to free speech or the responsibility for free speech. How important do I believe that right is? Jesus, that's a tough question. My dad's a hunter. He has 200 rifles, something like that. They're all single shots because he believes in aiming carefully. The culture I come from, which is northwestern Canada, is a rural culture, a hunting culture. People take their guns seriously there, and it is definitely part of their lifestyle. I mean, my dad's hunted his whole life, and we ate wild meat almost all the time I was growing up. I think that the right to bear arms is one of the markers of a free society. I don't think it's reasonable that only the police and the army should be allowed to be dangerous. Having said that, well, I think I'll just leave it at that. I mean, I feel obligated in some sense to go farther, especially with regards to what happened in Las Vegas, but it seems to me that mostly what happens after these mass shootings is that the event gets absolutely politicized and people take their standard positions, and there's no moving either side, and that's too bad. But I think that it's unfortunate to use an event like the Las Vegas event or the Columbine shootings to make political capital, and I think that's usually what happens, and so I'm not going to do that. I think it's an important right. I believe that the individual should be allowed or even encouraged to be dangerous, but controlled, So along with that right is a responsibility, and I guess maybe from the NRA there should be more discussion of responsibility. Is that possible? That seems to me to be reasonable. So any advice for a person with intense chronic pain who wants to become a it switched on me. Oh, there we go. Crayola Sheep says, any advice for a person with intense chronic pain who wants to become a contributing member of society, specifically having the self-discipline to push through pain to take care of responsibilities? Well, the first thing I would say is that if you have intense chronic pain, then my heart goes out to you, because that's really awful. And so I think that you can cut yourself a break. I think the fact that you want to become or continue being a contributing member to society is a testament to your fortitude. I guess the first thing I would ask you is if your pain has been reasonably managed. You probably know this, and I'm not giving you any medical advice because I can't, but you might want to note that there are antidepressants that are quite effective as long-term pain medications, and you may already know that, but if you don't, then you should check that out, because they're not addictive, and they can be a very effective adjunct. I would also say that the literature on chronic pain tends to indicate that more activity is better than less, and that's partly because when you get engaged in something that's meaningful, let's say, and important to you, that activates the dopaminergic system, the same system that cocaine activates, and that can produce a fairly pronounced analgesic effect. So I would say everything that you can do to get yourself occupied with things that you regard as important and worthwhile is actually probably going to help you manage your pain better. It looks like inactivity is bad generally speaking, for chronic pain. I mean, obviously that's not the case if the sort of activity that you're engaged in is of the type that will aggravate an underlying chronic physiological condition. But I would say make a plan, make a daily plan, make a weekly plan, make it, push yourself a little bit farther than you can go comfortably on a weekly basis and see how far you can get in a year. That's because what's your choice? I mean, you're laying there suffering is not preferable to doing things and suffering, not generally. So I would say, like, more power to you for trying, but also do keep in mind that activity, meaningful activity, is a good analgesic. So Eric Butler says, sheesh, Canadians never get it. Well, I don't know, we get it sometimes, Eric. Come on now, give us a break. We're just Canadians. We're freezing to death half the time. So, we do pretty well given the fact that every day here in the winter is the equivalent of a national catastrophe in the U.S. So, anyways. Betsy Kirkland says, if the Second Amendment is taken away, there will be nothing to protect your freedom of speech. That is how important it is. Yes, well, that is certainly the argument that people who are motivated to protect the Second Amendment make, and I'm not going to oppose that. So, freedom of speech is not licensed to bully. Yes, actually it is. That is exactly what it is. That's Cleek 0203. Freedom of speech is licensed to bully. It's licensed to offend. It's licensed to disrupt. It's all sorts of things that are unpleasant and upsetting. And that doesn't mean that you should go around bullying or being disruptive or upsetting. That isn't the same thing, but that is exactly what it is. So I'm afraid, Cleek 0203, you were wrong. Now then you say, use some discretion and thought. Well, yes, of course, that's perfectly reasonable advice, and that is what people should do. But, what constitutes discretion is often something that has to be discussed. And I would say that the threat to freedom of speech is being put forward very strongly by people who say things, well, it's not the same as the license to bully. And bullying, by the way, generally speaking, is a sequence of physical actions. When it's verbal bullying, which also can occur, then that has to be put in a somewhat different category. If you're interested in bullying, there's a great book, and seriously interested in it, there's a great book by a guy named Dan Always called Bullying, I think that's what it's called, What We Know and What We Can Do About It, Dan Always. And if if you're actually concerned about that sort of thing, you could read that book and see if there are places that you could put what he advises in schools, for example, into practice. So, Eric Young asked, what moment triggered your obsession with the topics outlined in the biblical series and maps? Well, that's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I wouldn't say it was a moment. I know that from the time I was about 16 till the time that I was 24 or so, I had recurrent nightmares about nuclear war. And so that was certainly part of it. And they were very vivid and very realistic. And so, and certainly my reading, especially about the Holocaust, also, and then later, Solzhenitsyn's accounts of the Gulag Archipelago, for example, and the horrors there, that was also a major contributor. It was my concern about the Cold War, I would say, that was really the trigger in general, because I wanted to understand. I took a political science degree first and looked at it from a political perspective, but most of my professors, by the time I was in my third or fourth year, insisted that the reasons that people fought were economic. And I never did believe that because, well, people fight about the things they value, but it isn't obvious why people value the things they value, So it's a psychological issue as far as I'm concerned, and not an economic issue. And so it was my dissatisfaction with the standard political science viewpoint or economic viewpoint, combined with this strange obsession I had about the Cold War. Maybe that's associated to some degree with my proclivity to depression. I mean, who knows, I don't know. I was obsessed with it, and it isn't obvious why things grip you and shake you like a rat, I guess there's something about that seems to be associated with what people used to call destiny. So, but it certainly was an obsession. When I was 23 or 24, when I started writing Maps of Meaning, I was thinking about it 16 hours a day at like top speed, just non-stop. And the only relief I could get from it really was to go out and work out with weights, which I did for quite a long time. I gained about 35 pounds in about a year and a half working out with weights. And I had to quit because I was eating so much, it was taking up like half my life. So anyways, I don't know what it was, Who knows what darkness lurks in the bottom of a soul, and why it's there. Maybe it was also the fact that I could see in myself the tendencies that might lead people to do terrible things. And I was also very, very curious about that. So maybe that was an encounter with the Jungian shadow, something like that. Jeremy Hulshoff says, will you lecture in the Netherlands? Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm coming to the Netherlands in January to lecture there. I'll put the link to that up on my website at some point in the relatively near future. So, Thugastrike, I've heard depressed people who stopped antidepressants said they never helped in the first place. What do you say to that, Mr. Peterson? Hey, that's certainly possible. Antidepressants don't necessarily work for everyone. My personal opinion is that antidepressants work quite well for many people whose lives are in decent order. So they have friends, they have family that love them, they have a career, they're educated approximately to the level of their intelligence, they have things to look forward to. But for some reason their mood is extremely distorted and negative. And I've seen antidepressants have miraculous effects on people like that. I think they're less likely to work when people have a plethora of life problems, which isn't exactly the same thing as being depressed. Like having a terrible life is not the same thing as being depressed, although the two can overlap. And it isn't obvious to me that people who, maybe they have a drinking problem or a drug abuse problem and they're unemployed and they have a pathological family and their friends aren't good for them and they have a string of failures behind them and they don't have much to look forward to in the future and all that. It's a lot for an antidepressant to overcome, but under those circumstances maybe the antidepressants can help stave off feelings of like suicidal feelings and that sort of thing. But antidepressants don't work for everyone. But some people they work really well for, and if you're depressed, they're definitely worth a try. In a month if they're going to work. Also, there are a variety of different kinds of antidepressants, and you have to figure out dose, and you have to figure out when you should take them during the day, and you have to figure out type. So they're not a cure, they're a tool for helping control negative emotion, and they can be very effective. So, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people that they didn't help. So that's what I would say about that. What the player formerly known as Mouse Cop says, what do you think the role of psychedelics will be in the future? Marijuana will most likely be somewhat legal everywhere in the US, and this may push someone to try stronger psychedelics. Is this bad? Let's start with the first one. I have no idea what the role of psychedelics will be in the future. I know that the FDA just cleared ecstasy for use for post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's very interesting. I know there's some very interesting work being done at Johns Hopkins on psilocybin mushrooms, which seem to be very effective, for example, in helping people stop smoking. I think that we don't know anything about psychedelics at all. I mean, we know that they seem to have an effect on the serotonin system, but that's a pretty broad brushstroke. I think they're incalculably peculiar, and that they reveal things about the structure of the world that we are beyond ignorant about. I have no idea what role they'll play in the future. I don't know what to think about psychedelics at all. Marijuana will most likely be somewhat legal everywhere in the US, and this may push some to try stronger psychedelics. Is this bad? I suppose it depends on how they're used, whether or not it's bad, and what the intent is. I think they're very bad party drugs. Psychedelics aren't for fun. I don't think that that's the right way to use them at all. I think they need to be used seriously. and they need to be used in a manner that's life-affirming, and they need to be used in a manner that's commensurate with genuine exploration, and they need to be used carefully or they can cause a lot of trouble. So Carl Jung said, beware of unearned wisdom, and I think that's very wise. So anyways, I hope that we continue investigating them scientifically, because there's much to be learned there, much more than we can imagine as far as I'm concerned. F-Tail5 says, what's up with all these frog occurrences? I've never seen such synchronicity. Man, I don't know what to say about that. I had some frog synchronicity occurrences earlier this year that just about made me faint, so I don't know. I have no idea what to make of it. It leaves me speechless. That's all I can say about that. Carl Jung had some strange ideas, and one of them was synchronicity, the fact that things could line up in a way that seemed meaningful. And, much as I don't understand how that occurs, I've experienced it many, many times and in very convincing ways. And so it's one of the things that leads me to think that the world isn't structured the way that we think it is. I think it's structured more like a symphony, and there are times when different parts of the world, different parts of being can come into harmony spontaneously and all point in the same direction. And why that happens, I have no idea. I don't understand it at all. So all right, so let's go back to the pre-existing questions. Seaman Eric says, apologies for the weird question. Have you ever performed a ritual sacrifice? No, I haven't. And it is a weird question, although I can understand why you would ask it. I have performed psychological sacrifices, I suppose, when I decided to give up something that I needed to give up so that I could move forward into the future. That certainly happened when I quit smoking, and when I more or less quit drinking. I still have a drink from time to time now, but I quit for 20 years. And that was a sacrifice. I couldn't continue to drink. Again, I said I was from northern Alberta. It was pretty hard drinking culture, and I really liked alcohol, but I couldn't drink and write and do my PhD and manage my family responsibilities. It was too much, and so I stopped, and that was a good thing. So that was a sacrifice. And you are very critical of postmodernism and the egalitarian wave of the 60s. Isn't there a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Are there positive things about these movements? At the moment, no, not really. I don't think there's much positive about them at all. I think they've gone way too far. I think they dominate the humanities. The postmodernism, the fact that the postmodernist point is that there is a very large number of ways to interpret any closed set of phenomena, something like that, any limited set of phenomena, and that's true, but it's shallow. It's very, very shallow doctrine, and if I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater, then it's a baby that needs to be thrown out, I'm afraid. Are there positive things about these movements? Not at the moment. I can't see anything positive about it. I think it's degenerated into ideological claptrap, and I think it's destroying the universities. So the egalitarian wave of the 60s, that's a different issue, I would say. I don't think it's reasonable to deny the utility of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, for example, and there were movements before that, like the labor movement, that had real justification for being. It isn't that everything that always happens on the left is bad. I don't think that at all. I think that the people who are, let's say, on the lower end of the economic distribution need a powerful voice in politics. I think that's only fair. And I mean, there is room for an egalitarian-oriented ethos, but that isn't what equity is. This has become completely ideological, and there's just no excuse for it as far as I'm concerned. So, if you plan on doing meetups with more intellectuals like Camille and Sam Harris, who would be your pick? Well, I'm going to meet Jonathan Haidt. That'll be good. I really admire his work. I think he's a really good guy, so I'm looking forward to talking to him. I'd like to talk to Thomas Sowell, I think it's Sowell. I think that would be interesting. The rest of it, I have to think more about that. I mean, but those are two that I would definitely like to talk to. I'm going to speak with Jocko Willink. I think I mentioned that, so that might be interesting. Will there be a third talk with Sam Harris? Maybe this time with Sam as your guest and you taking your gloves off. I don't have any plans for a third talk with Sam. I wouldn't be opposed to it, although I think we probably got about as far as we were going to get in our second discussion. I think the two discussions together actually worked quite well. So I think, and this is no, I'm not saying this in any negative way, but I think a third discussion might be beating a dead horse, and like I'm not interested particularly in putting Sam on the spot, and it's also possible that he would put me on the spot. It isn't necessarily that I would come out victorious, so to speak. I mean, he's a very sharp guy, and there's many compelling arguments to be made in favor of atheism, even though I think that overall it's a stance that lacks. I don't think it contends with its opponent fairly, because I don't think that the atheist community in general takes the thought of serious religious thinkers seriously. I think they tend to straw man them, but okay. Could you please offer advice for individuals with high intelligence but low extroversion and low agreeableness in making and maintaining social connections and friendships? Well, that's Roger. I would say make a plan, again, spend some time on it weekly. Go to things like meetups. There's a site called meetup.com. That's a good place to meet people. Do whatever you have to meet people. Take a course. Strike up a conversation. And ask questions and listen. That's particularly good if you're low in agreeableness. People really like to be listened to. You don't want to pester them with questions too badly, but you can get an awful long ways by listening to people and asking them questions. People hardly ever get listened to, and they're so damn happy when you do it that they're likely to open themselves up to you very, very rapidly. So get them talking, and when they say something you don't quite catch or understand, then ask them about it, and that can help you move forward. But put some time into it. Like, you need to be going out at least once a week, and find some social places that you can go to regularly. That's another thing you can do, is that pick a couple of hangouts, like a local bar or something like that, or whatever. But go there regularly and say hi to the people who own it and run it, and eventually you'll be a regular, and then you can start to meet people by doing that. But it might take you 2 or 3 years to get good at it. I've seen people go from being afraid to strike up to have a conversation with a friend in a coffee shop, like have a panic attack thinking about that, to actually doing stand-up comedy. So you can really move yourself a long ways if you make a long-time plan. So, okay, John Dem, I've only got 3 dots after that, says, how should a manager use the Pareto principle in his favor at work? I find myself constantly focusing on the bottom 20% that causes 80-95% of the team's poor performance. Oh, that's easy. The managerial literature, the solid managerial literature, is absolutely crystal clear on this. Spend all your time with your highest producers and put your lowest producers where they can do the least amount of damage. The probability that as a manager you're going to be able to solve the problems of the poorest 5 to 20% of your work team is 0. You just don't have the time or the resources at your disposal. So what you should definitely do in order to increase performance is to concentrate on your top performers. I know that's not what managers do. They do exactly what you say. They focus on the bottom 5 to 20%. But that's exactly the wrong thing to do as a manager. Focus on your best people. They're hyper productive, as you already know. So, maybe you need to reconceptualize the way that you're interacting with your people. But you should have regular conversations, at least, with those that you think are outstanding. Let them know that you really, that you're really happy with their performance, and see what you can do to get obstacles the hell out of their way. Because as a manager, essentially what you should be doing is identifying the top performers and then doing everything you can to clear out obstacles in their path. That's the right way to think about it. And also to give yourself enough time to develop a medium to long-term plan and stop fighting fires on a day-to-day basis. You need at least 90 minutes a week to think about where you want things to be going in the medium to long term. So, but I can't overemphasize the importance of dealing with your top productivity, your highest, your most productive people. That's where all the gains are. How are you doing? Someone is asking me. You said someplace that you felt like you were at times dancing on broken glass. No, I think I said that I always felt like I was dancing on broken glass. Are you getting enough rest and R&R? Is the food sensitivity getting worked out? I think maybe the food sensitivity thing is getting worked out. I think it's at the basis of this depression that's been plaguing my family for generations. But I haven't figured out exactly what it is yet. I'm working very hard on that with my daughter, who also seems to have the same problem. And it is absolutely brutal. It's absolutely brutal. So, am I getting enough rest in R&R? That's hard to say, because with the responses that I've been having that have knocked my health back, it's hard to discriminate between rest and R&R, the lack of that, and just getting walloped by eating what appears to be the wrong thing. So it's so funny because, for years I was very skeptical of anyone who was concerned about, gluten sensitivity and that sort of thing, but I sure learned that was arrogant. So, yeah, well, I found many times in my life that you have to be aware of what you are judgmental about, because many things come back to haunt you. So, Dr. Peterson, do you have suggestions for how to make a schedule that doesn't make you a tyrant? I have watched your previous videos, but I'm struggling to make a weekly schedule that is productive. Hey, Joshua, start by making a weekly schedule that you want. Really, imagine that you're designing your schedule so that you can have the life you want. Just start with that. And be easy on yourself to begin with. You'll get better at it. You can add more responsibilities as you practice. So start by just scheduling in a few things that you'd like to do, and then load it up over time. But remember, get your attitude right. I'm using this schedule so that I can have the days and the weeks and the months that would make my life, that would optimize my life, right? Not so that I should do what I need to get done. I mean, obviously that's necessary, but that's not the right goal. So, what are your thoughts on students taking Adderall? Are there any long-term effects? There are long-term studies of the utility of Adderall for attention deficit disorder hyperactivity, and the results are basically negative. There's no evidence that the medications help with academic performance over the long run. I think that Adderall is an amphetamine. It is addictive. It can sensitize you to other dopamine agonists. So I would generally say it's something to be avoided. You also want to really watch it in combination with marijuana, for example, or psychedelics, because you can get unlucky and trigger a psychotic episode, and that is not a good thing, because once you have one psychotic episode, you're a bit on the broken side, and it's hard to put yourself back together. So I would say use it sparingly, if at all. It's not a good plan, and especially not something good to be doing habitually. So. Any reading tips for becoming teachers who don't want to be corrupted by the current teacher education at the universities? Well, I would say, you can. I have a reading list on my book on my website, jordanbpeterson.com. You could go look there. I'm going to add some more books to it. Read as much classic literature as you can. Read history. Like, go into the libraries, and look at great books programs. That's what I would say. And you have to educate yourself at the university. I mean, that's always been the case, and it's even more the case now. Is go back and read great literature, great philosophy, great thinkers, and you'll learn a tremendous amount that way. And I think otherwise there's no way you can avoid being corrupted by the current teacher education at universities. The education faculties are absolutely dreadful, absolutely dreadful. So Gabriel Andrade says, Jordan, please help me. I'm 99th percentile in openness and 0th percentile in conscientiousness. Yeah. Well, how old are you? That's the first thing. If you're young, that's because younger people are less conscientious. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you're very open like that, you need to be doing something creative. But you're going to have to learn how to discipline yourself. There's just no way around it. And I would say go do the future authoring program. That's a good start. And you'll have to learn how to schedule your time and how to get up at the same time every day. And it's going to be a real struggle. But, you can do it. I've had students who are very high in openness and low in conscientiousness as graduate students, and they discipline themselves. You need to find something that you're really interested in, that you're willing to pursue. And then you have to hit it hard. So that's what I would say. But do the future authoring program and get yourself a plan and start to implement it. And every time you fall astray, then get back at it. And you may have to build up your conscientiousness over a number of years, but it's worth doing. So my favorite Tom Waits song, I really like Cold Water. My son does a vicious version of Cold Water, but I really like Cold Water. What else? I like Hoist That Rag. That's a pretty decent song. I like dozens of Tom Waits songs. What else? I have this mental tick where when anyone asks me a question having to do with a name, names immediately vanish from my mind. Anyways, I really like Cold Water. I think that's a great song. Is it wrong to turn down a promotion? Is withdrawing from overwhelming additional responsibility the equivalent of ignoring God's call to Abraham? Not necessarily. It depends on what it is that you're doing instead. Like if you have a better option, then take the better option. If you're afraid, if it's just fear, then you might want to find somebody to talk to about that and walk through your fears and make a plan, because it's possible that it's the equivalent of ignoring God's call to Abraham. If it's pure fear, then I would take a look at that. But if you have a better option, well, it's up to you to decide the course of your life. So I wouldn't say that necessarily it's a bad thing. Not everyone wants overwhelming responsibility at work, and people are interested in their private lives and they're interested in their friendships or what they do outside of work. So, and I think that's all valid. But if it's just fear, then you need to find someone to talk to and talk it through to make sure that you're not throwing away an opportunity that, the other thing too is that, what's your mood like? Are you depressed? Like maybe you're underestimating your ability. Somebody thinks you're worthy of promotion. And you have to remember too that when you get promoted, like almost everybody feels like an imposter for the first year when they're promoted to a new position, because you don't know what the hell you're doing. So you're kind of acting out the role before you're qualified to do it, but that's okay. It takes a while to fit into a new skin. So if you're perfectionistic, that's another thing to take into account. So, all right. I'm not very religious, but your way of presenting the biblical stories have given me a respect for their function in society. How do I address those who actively oppose the wisdom on atheist principles? Well, look, I think what you do is, you say what you've found carefully, and if they refuse to listen and just like put up an impenetrable wall, then you shut the hell up and go find someone else to talk to. That's the doctrine behind not casting pearls before swine. There's a good rule, which is if you're not being listened to, then shut up, because you're not where you think you are. There's something going on that you haven't put your finger on. You're not in the place that you think you're in. And so you could also turn from convincing to questioning. If someone's very, very set in their views, instead of opposing them, you can ask them to elucidate their views, and you can use that questioning process. It's like a Socratic dialogue to dig into their fundamental principles, and sometimes that's a good way of opening up a space for dialogue. So what do you make of the Gnostic Gospels? For example, the Gospel of Thomas. Well, I've read the Gospel of Thomas, and I think it's a remarkable document. There are things in it that are extraordinarily powerful. I closed Maps of Meaning, in fact, the book I wrote in 1999, with a quotation from the Gospel of Thomas. And it's really interesting, too, that the first person who got his hands on that Gospel was Carl Jung, which I think is an amazing example of synchronicity, right? The first of the Gnostic Gospels that was released into the broader world ended up in Carl Jung's hands. Absolutely amazing historical fact. So they seem to me to be extraordinarily interesting. And I read them, I suppose, in some ways the same way that I read the canonical Bible. I'm trying to extract out what wisdom there is in them, or what wisdom I can understand anyways, and utilize it to the degree that I can. So in one of your videos you mentioned about the power that creates order from chaos, but can also create chaos from pathological order. Can you expand and explain the latter one? Well, the logos, that's the human capacity for consciousness and communication and awareness, and I think that it's actually one of the fundamental prerequisites for being itself, right? Which is one of the things that makes me different from a standard materialist. I don't believe that there can be being without consciousness, and so I think of consciousness as a primary element of reality. It's an irreducible element of reality, something like that. A prerequisite for reality. That's another way of thinking about it, and that's the logos essentially. And it's respect for the logos, I would say, that's the deepest doctrine of the biblical stories. Now, what does the logos do? Well, you can see this in Christ's story, most particularly. So Christ is often presented as a social revolutionary, cast, I suppose, in the same mold as Moses. Moses opposed the Egyptian tyranny, like Christ opposed the tyranny of the Pharisees and the scribes. And Moses produced chaos as a consequence of opposing the tyranny, right? First chaos was the crossing of the water, and Moses was a master of water, and that's the same symbolically as being a master of chaos. But after he freed the Hebrews from the Egyptian tyranny, well, they entered a period that was 40 years long, so the story goes, of almost complete chaos, right? Abandonment in a desert, tremendous moral confusion, lack of direction and purpose. And so sometimes the hero is the person who makes order out of chaos, but sometimes the hero is the person who makes intermediary chaos out of an order that's become too tyrannical. And so it's best to think of the logos as the force that keeps order and chaos in balance, rather than generating order out of chaos or chaos out of order, because the logos operates to do one of those two things depending on the situation. And so it's frequently generating order out of chaos because there's plenty of chaos, but there's also plenty of tyranny, in which case the hero or the person who embodies the logos is struggling to destroy the tyrannical king and replace him with someone that's more that's playing a more reciprocal and properly negotiated game. So, all right, everyone, I'll answer like 2 more questions, I would say, and then I have to stop because I'm getting fuzzy-minded. So, To what extent do you think your tips for young people, clean your room, make a schedule, read great books, are predicated on your own personality? Well, I think they're predicated on my personality to some degree. I think that a lot of my conscientiousness, such as it is, has been learned. I think I disciplined myself, particularly in graduate school. So I don't think that's necessarily an intrinsic part of my personality. I think it's something that I learned to do because I felt that I had something that was worthwhile to do. So it's very difficult to answer it beyond that because, I am affected by my own personality, obviously. Although I think that I give advice that's pretty balanced across all the dimensions, like I think that you should be capable of speaking in public fluently and that you should be able to communicate with groups of people. I think that you should be able to be solitary and work on your own. So that covers extroversion and introversion. I think that working on control of negative emotion is important. And so that's partly dealing with anxiety and stress, and that's the neuroticism dimension. I think that you should be agreeable when it's necessary and disagreeable when it's necessary. And so that's a broadening along the agreeableness dimension. I think that discipline is really important. In a complex society like ours, discipline is extremely important. And so I think that being able to be conscientious and reliable and orderly to some degree is necessary, but that you should be able to withdraw from that when necessary so that you can take a break and have some fun. I think you can risk becoming overcommitted to your work or to your endeavors. I do think that that's something that I risk. Maybe I trained myself to be too industrious. It's certainly possible. Openness, well, that might be a place where I have a personality predicated blind spot because I'm very, very high in openness. But I do believe that there's utility in exposing yourself to the world of great ideas. And that's not for everyone, I mean, there are people who are fundamentally conservative in their orientation, and more power to them, I suppose. But if you're going to read, then you should read great things. And if you're interested in the life of the intellect, the philosophical life, then there's much to be learned by reading great books. So I don't think that I'm overwhelmingly biased with regards to my own personality, but you never know. I mean, it's hard for someone to judge that about themselves. So can one reason with a stalker? My stalker is highly intelligent and rational, making him scarier. I am beginning to work with police and lawyers, but wondering if you have experience in this realm. I would say, not knowing the specifics of your situation, no, you can't really reason with a stalker. The stalker has already gone beyond the realm of normal social behavior, and I would say with most stalkers, assuming that you're dealing with a genuine article, that they tend to be a little bit on the paranoid side, or maybe a lot on the paranoid side. And the problem with people who are paranoid is that they have adopted a couple of axioms as absolutely fixed, and there's no shifting them. So I would say, I hate to give advice in a situation like that, but I would say that the probability of using reason is precluded by the fact of the stalking behavior. So good luck with it. That's very scary. It's hard for people to be protected from someone who's intent on following them and perhaps on making their life miserable. So insights on how I would overcome or live with my fear of malice and disappointment in man. Mike the Nub. Well, here's something that you might consider. So when you're a child and you're naive, then you trust people because you're naive and you don't know any better, and you don't know that people can hurt you unless you're a very unfortunate child. So your trust isn't a virtue. It's just a sign of your innocence, let's say. And that kind of innocence isn't a virtue, it's just lack of experience. But when you're older, Mike, courage or trust is a hallmark of courage. You extend your hand to people and you extend your trust to people, knowing full well that you can be bit, like you might be bit by a cobra. You can be betrayed and disappointed by people. But you extend your hand in trust because of courage, because you decide to take the risk. And by taking that risk, you open the door to the best in people. But you won't see that door open unless you first take the step to trust. And so I would say you have to practice trusting people. You know, you have to share things that are somewhat private. You have to ask people for small favors and trade small favors. And you have to do that knowing full well that you can get hurt. So think about it as an act of courage instead of naivety well, instead of naivety. Let's leave it at that. So that's what I would recommend. All right, everyone, I'm going to stop. So once again, thank you very much for listening to me tonight. I hope that it went well. I can never tell when I'm doing this, but they seem to be popular. I'm very pleased that you all spend so much time putting these questions together and watching my videos and listening to me. I'm genuinely and continually amazed and grateful about that. So I hope you all have a good month and that you continue working as hard as you can on putting yourself together, because the more together people there are, the better things are going to go for everyone. And it's very important, as I've pointed out before, that you get your individual life in order. So good night, everyone, and keep up the good work, man. See ya.